Okay, let's dive into this stack of material. It's definitely going to make us look at some really core parts of our lives, our families, careers, maybe even those feelings we get, like being a bit out of step. But yeah, through a really specific, kind of unusual lens.
Yeah, unusual is the right word. And I mean, the central idea we're digging into, pulling a lot from Joseph Heinrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World, and these other sources, is that the way most of us live and think now, especially in the West, it's not the historical default at all. It's actually pretty strange when you look at the big picture of human history.
Exactly. It really challenges that idea that, our modern world, with all its choices and pressures, is just how things were always meant to be. So this deep dive, it's all about unpacking what it means to be weird Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, and trying to see how this specific type of society might connect to, well, things like information overload, maybe feeling like an imposter sometimes, and that push and pull between what feels like your calling and what society tells you to do.
And it really kicks off with this pretty bold claim in the material that your family, going back, probably wasn't weird. And this huge shift from that non-weird past to our weird present that might just explain some of the struggles, the anxieties you might feel today.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Why is that shift so important?
Well, first, let's just nail down that acronym again, WEIRD. It's Heinrich's framework. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
Right. And the real power of looking at it this way, like the book lays out, is understanding how these weird societies became so psychologically different from pretty much everyone else throughout history.
Yeah.
And also how they got so, well, prosperous. They developed a very specific outlook.
Exactly. When you frame it like that, you realize things we just take for granted, like being super individualistic, thinking analytically all the time, focusing on personal goals, they're actually outliers, historically and globally speaking.
Okay, now here's a really interesting connection the sources make. They link that big historical change directly to something very, very current. The absolute explosion of self-help stuff.
It makes a certain kind of sense, doesn't it? I mean, think about it. If you lived in a more traditional setup, your role was pretty much laid out for you, family, community, gender, whatever. You didn't really need a constant barrage of advice on who to be or what your unique purpose was.
The path was kind of set.
Yeah, largely. But then, boom, you land in a weird world and the old script is just gone.
Yeah.
You suddenly have, or at least it feels like you have, endless options. And into that vacuum rushes what one source calls this fire hose of content.
Right, the too much viral load in self-help. This feeling of a help-yourself world where you're always supposed to be optimizing, finding your passion, reinventing yourself. It's exhausting.
And connected to this, the material suggests, is maybe a fading of traditional religious belief. As societies got more individualistic, more focused on personal journeys, people found it trickier to connect those big ancient religious traditions to their specific individual goals.
It's fascinating, though, because that basic human need for connection, for shared meaning, it doesn't just disappear, does it?
Yeah.
The source mentions how people now might find that connection in really intense fandoms, like for bands, concerts, shared hobbies. It's almost like a new kind of tribe.
Yeah, or you see these interesting blends popping up, like musicians getting into, say, Buddhism, looking for spiritual insights, but maybe not the whole religious structure, that SB&R thing, spiritual, but not religious. The source calls it a strange bedfellow of weird. It's wanting meaning, but through that individualistic, modern filter.
Okay, so all this freedom, this pressure to define yourself, losing those old structures, it loops back to something a lot of people feel, that imposter syndrome. And the sources ask, what if that feeling isn't about you failing, but about trying to cram yourself into this weird box that just doesn't quite fit with something deeper?
Which brings us right back to that core idea. Your family wasn't weird originally. The suggestion here is that this nagging feeling, this sense of maybe not quite belonging or doing the right thing, could be an echo from your family's deeper past, from a deep tribal history that was around long before things got weird.
That's a really compelling thought. I mean, we all navigate the internet, this shared digital space, but we also have our own, internet, as Caroline Myss calls it. And what Heinrich's work adds, according to this material, is that our internet isn't just us. It's loaded with our deep history, too.
And that history looks radically different from our modern world. Before all this, your place was much more fixed. Roles often came down to gender, family tradesmen, hunt, women gather, or farm, or whatever. The specifics changed with tech, obviously, but the sources suggest those underlying archetypal pulls might still be there.
But then things started shifting, big time. The rise of universities, maybe 11th, 12th century-ish, and then especially the Enlightenment in Europe, suddenly there's this growing focus on your internal intellectual life and this really radical idea that you could have lots of other options than just what you were born into.
And bam, there's the tension. That imposter feeling could literally be the sound of your deep history. Maybe it's genetic, maybe it's family traditions passed down, maybe even epigenetic stuff nudging you one way, while the weird world demands you go another way.
There's a personal reflection in here about that, like how if you go back just a couple of generations, most of our ancestors were tied to the land, right?
Yeah.
Agrarian. So maybe there's this archetypal top-down force still at play, pulling us towards certain things, like working with our hands, maybe.
Yeah, even if you're, say, an electronic musician, like the author here notes, finding yourself drawn to the physical side of it, building things, manipulating sound manually, they call it like rewilding, getting back to some kind of cultural default mode network.
Like an inherent drive towards certain kinds of making or doing, rooted way back, that just feels more fundamental.
Exactly. And this leads us straight into a major conflict, the material flags. This clash between that potential innate, historically shaped path and what modern society dictates.
Right. On one side, you've got these ideas, maybe from New Age thinking or higher consciousness stuff, that say you're born with a purpose already coded in you, like a seed, your dharma, your specific talents, very individualistic, your path is unique, maybe divinely guided, which is totally different from those old predetermined roles.
But then, smack bang against that, you have the massive influence of modern society. The sources actually pinpoint a specific moment where they think things maybe went off the rails a bit. The rise of the cubicle job culture starting around the mid-'80s, think millennials coming of age, the Reagan neoliberal era.
Okay, let's just clarify neoliberalist model here. In this context, it means that societal shift toward prioritizing, like corporate structures, climbing the career ladder, efficiency, often maybe over traditional skills, community bonds, or even just raw talent. The cubicle job becomes the symbol of a path defined by that new structure, often kind of detached from actual making or doing things tied to history or place.
Gotcha. And the argument in the sources is that this corporate path, the cubicle life, clashed with both the idea of a unique, maybe spiritual purpose, and that older model of skills passed down through families. It valued something else entirely, just climbing that abstract ladder.
So the hypothesis laid out is maybe, given our deep history, our potential inherited leanings, most of us actually aren't suited for typical office work. This feeling of being a square peg in a round hole, it could come from our heritage, our innate talents, societal pressure. Probably, the sources say, a mix of all three.
And the pressure doesn't stop there, especially with the attention economy. The sources talk about how creative folks now have to spend so much time on things like social media marketing. They call it shadow work.
Shadow work, meaning not dark psychological stuff, but work that's maybe necessary today, but pulls you away from your actual talent. Like if your core skill, rooted in history, was making things, then spending hours on Instagram algorithms is shadow work.
Exactly. It's dictated by this new society, and it eats up time from the real making.
So this pressure to do the shadow work to make the square peg fit the modern weird hole, that's seen as a direct result of that 80s shift, which kind of demoted the value of talents rooted in older family and tribal histories.
Which leads to probably the most startling statement in the material. If this whole analysis is right, then most of us have probably been doing the wrong thing our entire lives. And not just us, maybe our parents, our grandparents, the ones who made that big transition into being fully weird.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to chew on. So if that's the diagnosis, what's the proposed remedy? The sources suggest looking back at your family history, trying to find overlaps between what your ancestors actually did and options available today.
Yeah, they give a concrete example. If your father was an iron worker, maybe your pull isn't just generally towards arts and crafts, but maybe specifically towards something like ornamental ironwork. The trick is to look beyond the job title to the core talent underneath in that case. To make, to be creative.
Finding the shared essence, like what skills does a farmer share with an artist? Can you see a musical instrument as kind of like a farm tool, maybe? For creation. I mean, the sources acknowledge it sounds a bit out there, but they argue the connection has to exist somewhere.
Of course, then you hit the obvious counterexamples, right? Like incredibly creative people whose parents had totally normal, non-creative jobs back in the day. Bowie's dad worked for a charity. His mom was a housewife. Brian Eno's dad was a postman. Sting's dad, a milkman.
So how does the source explain them? Pretty bluntly. They were weird people. They grew up when those old, fixed paths were already fading fast. The idea of forging your own unique path, even one totally disconnected from family history, was becoming the new normal.
The material also briefly mentions other ideas like walk-ins, a niche concept about personality shifts, though the author says that's not their framework. And the idea that broader heritage, like being Italian, might connect you to an identity around art, the whole Renaissance man thing.
And it's not just direct family lines, right? The sources point out how big world conditions, these inflection points, massively shape careers too. World wars, pandemics, depressions, even joining the army, these things can totally derail one path and push someone onto another, like the author's father becoming an iron worker after the military.
Yeah, historically you had businesses literally called so-and-so and Sons, that passing down a profession was the default. The sources contrast that sharply with modern weird jobs like IT. And they wonder, do people in those Sons businesses find fulfillment differently on maybe spiritual or community levels that we don't measure the same way today?
Which brings in Jill Peirce. She's a family constellation therapist, Rupert Sheldrake's partner, morphic resonance guy. Her work digs into how family patterns, even traumas, can echo down the generations.
Right, and Peirce's findings, as presented here, apparently show really specific, sometimes surprising ways ancestors' lives influence descendants. She talks about inheriting these energetic streams, thoughts, intentions, unfinished business, trauma that get passed down.
And these inherited patterns, she argues, can really impact our choices, our emotions, how we develop.
So tying it all back, the sources suggest this slow evolution into the neoliberalist model, that shift towards corporate life, the cubicle world, might be actively damaging our natural leanings or inherited talents.
And given Heinrich's background in evolutionary biology, the implication is that this pull away from potentially ingrained historical paths could cause real problems, not just for us now, but maybe for generations to come.
Yeah, the author reflects on their own experience, deliberately choosing a path different from their family's interests. And they wonder about younger generations. Are they still on that individualistic, weird track? Or is there maybe more tension now as these older patterns bubble up?
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway here? This deep dive really highlights a potential major conflict, doesn't it? This tension between what our deep history, our family background, maybe even our biology primes us for, and the very different world, the weird world we actually live in.
Yeah, and just understanding that shift from fixed roles to this bewildering array of modern options, maybe that sheds light on why you might feel adrift sometimes, or like an imposter, or why some work feels like shadow work, just not quite you.
It definitely prompts you, the listener, to think about your own path. Does any of this resonate, this idea of inherited pulls versus societal pushes? Have you felt that friction yourself?
And maybe here's the final thought to mull over, straight from the core of this material. If our deep history really does incline us towards certain ways of being and doing, and if modern weird society constantly pulls us away from that, is that feeling of restlessness, that constant search for purpose we see everywhere today, is that maybe just the sound of our ancient wiring grinding against the gears of the modern world?